The Sega Genesis was a console that had a lot of firsts for me. It was the first console I imported for, the first console I had a job and could buy my own games for. Over the course of its life, it gave me so much that I consider to be absolutely iconic, and some of the best examples of pure game design the hobby has ever seen. Even though I enjoyed games from its competitors, I defended the Genesis whenever anyone criticized it. It didn't matter if it was the games, the hardware, whatever, the Genesis deserved respect in my view, and I was ride or die all the way. As I've gotten older, I have taken a more measured approach to conversations about how things were back then. And invariably, the one thing that comes up time and time again is the Genesis ability to display color. As many of you know, the VDP in the Genesis could display a maximum of 64 on-screen colors out of a palette of 512. Though most games didn't use them, a few other methods like shadow and highlight as well as palette swapping could display 2 to 3 times that in certain circumstances. Many people question whether those specifications were a detriment to the platform's long-term success. That there is the subject of today's video. We are going to do a rundown across 6 years of the Genesis and how I felt about its hardware, specifically its color capabilities. I made this one for those of you that love this great platform, so let's get right to it. When the Genesis burst onto the North American gaming scene in 1989, the Nintendo Entertainment System was the dominant platform. By that point, arcade games had gotten far more sophisticated, especially when it came to color, sprite size, and animation, leaving NES games looking rather tame in comparison. The Genesis, on the other hand, was a revelation. You didn't hear anyone complaining about color in those early days, because home games had never looked as good as they did on Sega's new platform. Take a look here at Altered Beast side by side with the arcade. Imagine what a kid would think at this point. No, the Genesis did not replicate every detail exactly, but take a look at how close it got a game that was only a year old at that point. The same could be said of a game like Ghouls and Ghosts. The latest arcade games were coming across extremely well on the Genesis, living up to Sega's claim of the arcade experience at home. Golden Axe was another one that ported over extremely well. Not only were the sprites impressive, but the magical effects were something else. These games had come from arcade boards that could display lots more color than the Genesis, yet none of that seemed to make a difference at all. While not a one-to-one comparison, take a look at the original Shinobi next to the Revenge of Shinobi. The Genesis comes away looking extremely powerful and in some ways quite a bit more sophisticated. Those early months after the Genesis released were special, and there was nothing else flexing quite as impressively on the home market. As we get deeper into 1990 and that first year on the market comes to a close, the Genesis is still managing to impress in release after release. If anything, things are getting better as programmers and developers get more experience. Strider is a bona fide success story when compared to his CPS arcade counterpart. When I first laid eyes on this impressive port, I thought Sega had somehow shrunk the arcade down and fit it inside the cartridge. Some things looked different and some things sounded different, but you really didn't care because the end product was so familiar, it really was the arcade at home. But the Genesis was so much more than just arcade ports even in those early days. When Castle of Illusion showed up, it was easily one of the prettiest home games any console had ever achieved. The detail and color use at that time was spectacular, looking nearly as good as the movies that inspired it. When the kids in school talked about the Genesis, it was with wonder and admiration, with even Nintendo diehards having to admit that Sega had something special. And speaking of special, sometimes the Genesis would get a game that was inspired by an arcade release that would turn out even better. Shadow Dancer at home was not the same game at your local laundromat. Stage design, boss encounters, and numerous other changes made the two quite unique from one another. And I dare say the Genesis version looked better in pretty much every way. Main hero, the dog, the enemies, and the backgrounds just came across more impressively, especially the bolder colors. There were many other games in 1990 that stood out, but I think you get the point. The Genesis was a graphical juggernaut, and the stage was set for it to grow even more the following year.
That's it. Look at him. Give him the left. Look at it. No. Him. That's him. That's it. Go get it. Give him the left. The left. That's it. That's it.
"1991 was really a special year in video gaming history for me. It was the year that the Genesis and the Super Nintendo went head-to-head for the very first time. Nintendo's new console could display 256 on-screen colors out of a palette of over 32,000, a specification that obliterated the Genesis on paper. But that first year was anything but a win. In fact, when you put Sonic against Mario World in a side-by-side comparison, the Genesis stands its ground as a fantastic-looking representation of what 16-bit hardware was capable of. I mean, the last thing on my mind was that the Genesis could only display 60-some colors at a time. Sonic was fast, colorful, and loaded with background layers, everything 16-bit visuals needed to impress. 1991 was also the year Streets of Rage went head-to-head with Final Fight. I was really impressed with the sprite size in the latter. The main heroes and the enemies were absolutely huge, and it made for one great-looking beat-em-up. But I never really felt that color was of any concern in Streets of Rage otherwise. In fact, I kinda enjoyed the darker, grittier world in that game, especially with every scene seemingly taking place at night or inside a building of some type. Streets of Rage also came with the added bonus of having a 2-player mode and far more enemies on the screen. Pump that sucker up to the harder modes to see what I mean. Sega's Disney excellence continued that year as well. Quackshot was yet another beauty that did the hardware proud. Coming off of Castle of Illusion, it had a lot to prove, but I was really happy with how it turned out visually. Again, color was not an issue at all, and I have no reservations in saying that it stood up well against the competition. Things really started to heat up in 1992. The Super Nintendo was gaining some steam, getting more games out, and carving its own path in the North American market. But the Genesis was holding its own and then some. Sonic 2 made its way out that year and in many ways eclipsed the original in color and stage design. And I don't know a single soul that didn't think it was an excellent looking game graphically. Streets of Rage 2 quickly made you rethink what the Genesis could do with a beat-em-up. This was brighter and more colorful, with far larger sprites, an upgrade that dropped the jaws of many a Sega fan. It looked a lot better in a side-by-side with Final Fight, and still had the 2-player mode and far more enemies on the screen. 1992 was also the year we started to see big-name multi-platform releases and games that were very similar in content. That year everyone got to see the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles go at it in 16-bit form. Now I have to admit I fully understand those that prefer the Super Nintendo version because of its more arcade-accurate content. But take a look at the side-by-side here. Can anyone honestly say that the Genesis Hyperstone Heist looks bad or even compromised visually? I'd argue not only does it look great, but not a single scene gives you the idea that color was sacrificed in any meaningful way. We wrap up 1992 with a look at World of Illusion, Sega's two-player Disney entry that year. Yep, it was another looker that really impressed. The Genesis hardware was 4 years old at this point once you consider its original Japanese launch, and yet at no point has its color capabilities become a liability or an outstanding concern for customers. The Genesis is selling well in both North America and Europe, a testament to not only its appeal in terms of software, but also its ability to continue to impress visually. "1993 was another banner year full of killer releases for Sega's 16-bit workhorse. You now had games on the market that didn't just look great with outstanding color, but developers kept pulling out all the stops with sprite and background effects that made some releases look like they were running on silicon derived straight from the arcade. Take a look and gawk at the mighty Thunder Force 4. I want you to ask yourself, had you seen this at its North American launch, would the first thing you would have thought was how the Genesis needed to display more color? Seriously, let these scenes soak into your eyeballs. It's an absolute knockout, and I dare say one of the most impressive 16-bit shooters ever created. And there were lots more. What about Rocket Knight Adventures? In many ways, including color use, I always thought this looked like a Super Nintendo game to begin with. Konami loved moving art style and assets between game releases, and this one just screams something you would have seen from them on Nintendo's platform. Shinobi 3 was another standard bearer for outstanding use of color. Every stage had its own unique feel, and the art design was carefully put into place to make the most out of what the Genesis could display. No matter which platform you owned, no matter what you preferred, you simply don't come away thinking, wow, the 64 colors of the Genesis ruined that presentation. As 1993 plays out, it easily becomes the most competitive year between the Genesis and Super Nintendo in terms of multi-platform releases. The year before, Street Fighter II had graced the home market and was a massive hit for Capcom and Nintendo. And now, finally, we got to see these two titans of home entertainment go head-to-head in one of the most important and popular games released in years. That comparison will be forever argued as to which one was better overall, but for now I want you to look at the screens primarily in terms of color and detail. I think it's pretty clear that the Super Nintendo edition uses a bit more color, but do you see these two games running and think to yourself, the Genesis Special Champion Edition is ruined or so significantly compromised that the Genesis itself suffered at retail? Of course not. Side by side, the Genesis scenes look great, and aside from a few small changes, it more than holds up next to Nintendo's newer hardware. The same could be said of other multi-platform titles. A look at WWF Royal Rumble is quite telling. Developers hardly ever used all of the color available on the Super Nintendo in the first place, so rarely was the Genesis needing that many to draw a screen that competed well. Even when the game was different but used the same IP, it came down to the developer itself on how well received it was. No game encapsulates that more during that generation than Aladdin. The Genesis game was developed by Virgin Games, while the Super Nintendo got its version from Capcom. The two visual styles were very different, and it was clear that Sega's edition focused on animation first and foremost. Seeing the two together, I can honestly tell you that I think they both look good, and each one has its strong and weak points. The one thing I never thought was that the Genesis version looks worse because of color. In fact, it's bright, detailed, and really pops in many of its areas. But for all of my gushing about how well the Genesis visuals held up over the years, I confess 1993 was the very first year color did indeed become a critique from which the Genesis could not escape. 1993 was the year Mortal Kombat came home to a massive marketing campaign across console and portable hardware. There's no way to sugarcoat it. The digitized assets of this game needed as much color as it could get to mimic the vastly superior arcade visuals. The Super Nintendo clearly has a massive advantage in this regard. Both the fighters and the backgrounds look superior on Nintendo's platform. So much so that it was really the very first time I said to myself in a multi-platform release that the Sega edition looks really bad in comparison. But Sega's ace in the hole was blood and accurate arcade fatalities. It skewed this conversation away from graphics and made it almost purely about content. Sega had dodged a bullet with this one, but it would not be so lucky the following year. 1994 was yet another incredible year for 16-bit releases on both the Genesis and Super Nintendo. Just when you thought Sega couldn't do anything new with Sonic, Part 3 comes out with a pretty startling overhaul to the visuals, and it was more colorful than ever. So big was this project that it got split into two separate releases that year, and once they were connected, made for Sonic's most prolific adventure to date. Sega had also gotten its very first official Castlevania title. Bloodlines was a throwback to the classic 8-bit vampire slaying epics that Nintendo enjoyed for years. Konami went with smaller sprites so it could maximize the special effects, and it worked. Bloodlines may have been closer to the original 8-bit aesthetic than the other 16-bit releases in the series, but the one thing it did exceptionally well were those great sprite effects. Bosses had segmented joints that were animated on another level. The stage design often mimicked 3D movement, or skewed the viewpoint like you were viewing the world through a distorted lens. Konami took that tiny 8-megabit cartridge and gave us a world that was uniquely Sega and Castlevania at the very same time. Streets of Rage received another entry with Part 3. While many are split on which region represented the material the best, I think we all can agree that it was a great looking beat 'em up no matter which version you played. Building off of the style of Part 2, we had a return of the large sprites now accompanied by even more frames of animation and new moves. No matter which beat 'em up you put it up against, the Genesis was still holding its own visually. Sega had been privy to a few versions of Turrican up until this point, but oh man did Mega Turrican hit a new high for the series. Look at these screens. Is there anything here that makes you question the color the Genesis could display in 1994, now a full 5 years into its North American run? I certainly didn't think so. Super Street Fighter II made its home console debut that year, and again, both home versions are very comparable in terms of visual presentation. It doesn't really matter if you prefer one over the other. What matters is these two games side by side are fine representations of the arcade, and you certainly don't walk away shaking your head in disgust either way. Contra was another game series that finally showed up on the Genesis, and again, even when compared directly to the Super Nintendo variant Contra 3, the Genesis has a strong showing. The best part of comparing releases like this is that because the hardware in these two were so very different, the special effects themselves were always unique. The Super Nintendo often relied on Mode 7 for many of its more impressive special effects, while the Genesis proved quite capable with good old-fashioned brute force processing behind it. We also got a slew of highly publicized multi-platform releases in 1994. Earthworm Jim showed up from Shiny Entertainment, which employed many programmers that had been part of Sega's Aladdin project. On both 16-bit machines it was animated well, had impressive color, and had one of the wildest presentations you had ever seen. Games were looking more and more like cartoons at this point, and I don't think the Genesis suffered much at all, even at this late stage. One game that really nailed that point was Mickey Mania, which was literally a series of cartoons reborn as a video game. Did that 64 on-screen color limit hamstring this release? I reject the notion that it does, because both these games were eye-popping showpieces from the programmers at Traveler's Tales. Acclaim's wrestling series was again multi-platform that year. WWF Raw added some new fighters and a new presentation, but mostly stuck to what we had seen before. It was still a solid game, particularly in multiplayer, and the two versions again looked more similar than they did different. The Lion King was a big release that year, and it had a lot to prove as a Disney game. It certainly had the animation, and it was as detailed and as colorful as any licensed game that year. That damn second stage was awful, but overall both 16-bit versions compared well. Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure was another popular multi-platform release that looked nearly the same on both machines. No kidding there. If I removed the identification at the bottom and randomized the screens, I bet few of you could actually pick them apart. We end the look at 1994 with Mortal Kombat 2, perhaps that year's most important release that appeared on both platforms. As before, the Super Nintendo carries a heavy advantage in terms of closeness to the arcade original. You see it across the fighters and the backgrounds. The digitized images from the source needed the extra color, and the Genesis just couldn't display it at the same level. Sega skirted this issue in the first because it had the content everyone wanted, but with the sequel on even ground, the Super Nintendo came away with a better visual representation that nobody could deny. The last few years of the Genesis life was marked with a number of interesting releases. Capcom's The Great Circus Mystery starring Mickey and Minnie is one of the finest examples of a multi-platform release holding up across both competitors. This one holds up really well no matter which one you choose, and even when one does something that sticks out, you get some nice touches on the other that's just as cool. Again, it's not about me questioning your preferences. It's about comparing the two and coming away thinking the color use on the Genesis ruined the experience to the point where you could label it a clear handicap. More multi-platform releases proved that point even further. NBA Jam was a winner no matter where you played it and which one you preferred. I personally think the Super Nintendo holds the edge here overall visually, but I don't think the Genesis release looks poor in the slightest. Same goes for WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. I was actually somewhat surprised the Genesis version held up as strongly as it did, given the digitized assets, but here you are. Looks damn good to me. Disney's Toy Story was another big one that held up visually on both. The Super Nintendo again has its touches where the additional color really helps, but the Genesis is more than acceptable in a side-by-side. I mean, in some cases it's tough to tell them apart. We also got two more Mortal Kombat releases in those final years. Mortal Kombat 3 and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 were roughly more of what we had seen before. The improved color on the Super Nintendo stood out in many areas, but I genuinely felt the series was strongly represented on the Genesis in these two releases, far more so than the previous two ports. This may be because a switch in developer happened. Probe did the first two while Sculptured Software did Part 3, and Avalanche did Ultimate based on their engine. Mortal Kombat had always looked a little rougher on the Genesis though, and that remained the case here. Outside of the multi-platform games that appeared on both consoles, the Genesis continued to hit home runs with exclusives that looked fantastic. Ristar was a colorful romp through a fantastical world that hadn't looked this bright and cheerful on the Genesis since Sonic first showed up. In fact, I challenge you to find me any 16-bit game on any console that blows this away visually. It's a good-looking game, plain and simple. Another showstopper was Alien Soldier. This treasure behemoth could have been a Neo Geo game, it looks so impressive. Big sprites, lots of color, tons of special effects, and just an all-around feeling of shattering your expectations of the hardware. Nobody came away from Alien Soldier moaning about color. The same could be said for the Adventures of Batman and Robin. This two-player co-op action run-and-gun had it all in terms of graphics. Scaling, rotation, background layers, line scrolling, color, you name it, and it was done well above what you'd expect on the aging Genesis. Comix Zone gets a special mention here because it's one of those games that appeared to shatter the color barrier on the Genesis. Its palette was really something else, and it came across as if you were genuinely playing a comic book that had come to life. It was short and tough, but it really stood out as a late release title that showed the Genesis still had some surprises left in its capabilities. Pocahontas was another beauty that made the most of what the Genesis could display. The animation was of course Disney quality, but the scenes they played out looked like they were ripped straight from the film. I still marvel at how well done it was to be released so late. The final games we will look at are Vector Man 1 and 2. This is the series that Sega developed to take on the pre-rendered craze that Donkey Kong Country was propelled by. There are many things here that I feel came off really well. The animation, some of the special effects, and the way many of the assets had a 3D look all impressed me. But there is no question that the more colorful Donkey Kong Country had more big market appeal. It was more organic as well, and that made for environments that were more familiar and friendlier. Vector Man also had a run and gun element to it that made it far more challenging for the average player. You could muck about in Donkey Kong Country for a long time before meeting a challenge that would stop you in your tracks, while Vector Man could do it just a few stages in. I think it would have been better off as a traditional platformer. Gameplay design aside, it looked good and had some impressive special effects. Our takeaway here is one that I really wanted to hammer home, about just how nice most Genesis games look throughout its lifetime. I want to stress again that this video wasn't about your preferences not being legitimate. You can feel the Super Nintendo had the better visuals all the way around, and still give the Genesis its due. What developers accomplished on that hardware originally launched in Japan in 1988 was quite something. So the answer to the question, did the 64 colors of the Genesis hurt it? I have to say absolutely not. There are instances where there is no doubt that the extra color the Super Nintendo could display gave it advantages. You saw this mostly in games that used digitized or pre-rendered assets. Using Mortal Kombat as an example, I think it's pretty clear the Nintendo releases fared better visually. When you look at the overall picture, however, I don't think the Genesis itself was hurt by its color limitations in the vast majority of its software. When a game was developed from the ground up just for the Genesis, the available color was used to a degree that rarely left its games lacking visual appeal. There was always differences between multi-platform releases, of course, especially when it came to special effects like Transparencies and Mode 7 scaling. But the bulk of what you saw on the screen was comparable, right down to the finest details of the characters and backgrounds. Nintendo certainly got more mileage out of the Super Nintendo in its later years, but this was mostly due to a massive gulf in sales between the two platforms in Japan, and the fact Sega launched its 32-bit platform well over a year earlier. I guess the best way to sum up my opinion on this is that while it would have been nice to have had some extra color output with the Genesis VDP, it really wasn't a deal breaker. Games still looked great, held their own more often than not, and sometimes even managed to punch well above its weight class. The big question now is, did the sound of the Genesis hurt its popularity and market performance? But we're gonna have to wait for the answer to that in a future episode. I'm Sega X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.